Welcome, I'm Mike Krause from the Independence Institute, filling in for John Caldera, who is stuck at a Lonely Hearts dating seminar at the Airport Marriott at the moment, and so we wish him the best with that. You know, one of the things we do at Independence Institute is we keep a couple of constitutional scholars around. Now, this takes a lot of work and a fair amount of maintenance, but for times like this, it's totally worth it when we need to talk about something as important as Magna Carta and the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, and also the importance of Magna Carta to our own founding documents, and how it still reverberates through constitutional jurisprudence in the United States even today. And to talk about it with us, Rob Natelson from Independence Institute. Thanks,
Good to
Rob.
be here. Good to be here.
Thanks, Rob. All right, you are a constitutional scholar, and one of your many bona fides is this book here, the original Constitution, what it actually said and meant. And what you tried to do here is to go back and discover what the founders meant by the words, the phrases that they used, and what their actual intent was in writing the Constitution. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that is. I don't try to spin it in any way. It's a work of honest historical scholarship. Try to identify exactly what the Constitution meant right after the adoption of the Bill of Rights.
All right. Well, in order to understand what the founders meant, you need to understand the founders' motivation, right? And so one of the big motivations of our founders would have been Magna Carta. They would have studied Blackstone in the law, and they would have studied English common law, and Magna Carta is an important part of those that legal theory. So to this month, the 800th anniversary of Magna Carta, and you actually went to Great Britain, to the British Museum to celebrate this. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I did. Actually, the British Library, 2 of the 4 extant copies of the original Magna Carta. There were several different editions of Magna Carta, but the original one is the one that evil King John signed on June 15th, 1215. And that is, 2 copies of that are in the British Library. And so what the British Library did in celebration of the 800th anniversary is they put together a magnificent exhibition, which takes you through the entire story, the background, the signing, and the 800-year history of how Magna Carta has become a signal for, or a symptom of freedom, really all over the world.
All right, so this is not just historically significant, this is also just a kind of a cool story. So let's set some historical background and we'll get into how this came to be. All right, so it's 1215, we're in medieval England. It's a feudal society, right, with a Norman aristocracy at the top and a royalty, and then various classes of Saxon Englishmen as the underclass, and very much a divided England with a lot of conflict. Yet somehow these 2 disparate groups came together in brotherhood, but it was not due to a kumbaya moment. It was because of a really, really horrible king. And we have King John mostly to thank for the fact that we ended up with Magna Carta. Tell us about this character, King John.
Yeah, well, as you say, it was a very divided society. If you remember your stories of Robin Hood, you know, Robin Hood occurred in the reign of King John's older brother, Richard the Lionheart. And that story is filled with episodes of conflict between the Norman nobles at the top and everybody else who was English. The Normans spoke French, English people spoke English, but John had simply annoyed everybody. He was not an unintelligent man. He was in some ways a competent ruler, but he was utterly ruthless and utterly untrustworthy. It started with the fact that he couldn't keep his paws off other men's wives. When somebody crossed him, he locked her up in a dungeon until she died of starvation, she and her oldest son. He killed his own nephew, and every time people complained, he promised to make things better. And he was charming, and he could get people to believe him, but ultimately they discovered he was ultimately untrustworthy. And so the barons raised a rebellion. And John was forced to come to a meadow on the Thames River called Runnymede and not sign, but seal a document promising to be good from then on. That didn't last very long. He soon repudiated the original edition of Magna Carta. The Pope, to whom he had given his country as a fief earlier in his reign, backed him up. And the barons rose in rebellion again. Fortunately, John did the best thing he ever did for England shortly thereafter by dying of dysentery. And the his successor was only 9 years old, his son Henry III, and Henry's regents reissued Magna Carta. They reissued it in the following year and the year after that, and again in the year 1225. And that last edition became permanently part of the law of England.
Okay, well, so there's very well-known aspects of Magna Carta, but then you've also, as you've been going around doing presentations on Magna Carta, you've pointed out that there's some lesser-known aspects of it that are actually quite important and that we actually still see today. And so let's talk about a couple of these things and and more importantly, what it was that guys like King John did that was the impetus for people to demand. I mean, think about this for a minute, that King John signed away, well, he repudiated, but signed away his own power. And sovereigns don't do that kind of thing. So there must have been some pretty compelling reasons for...
Yeah, there was compelling reasons. There was a lot of duress. He faced rebellion from all classes. And the fact that he faced rebellion from all classes is reflected by the fact that Magna Carta, unlike other medieval charters of its kind, was a very, very broad, almost universal document. Most of the benefits in Magna Carta went to the nobles.
Sure.
But what the difference was from other medieval charters is that it also included benefits for merchants, for ordinary freeborn people, and even a few benefits for serfs.
Right.
Women were not represented at the negotiating table directly, but there were also provisions in Magna Carta for women. And let me just give you an example to answer your question as to what John did. If a woman was married to one of John's vassals and this vassal died, John would announce to her that, number one, he was holding up her inheritance, and number two, that she would have to remarry whomever he wanted her to remarry. And so wealthy widows, in order to prevent this, had to pay John substantial amounts of money. So two of the provisions in Magna Carta protect women against disinheritance and against being forced to marry people that they didn't want to marry. John also had a habit of granting exemptions to current law to favored people. Does this sound familiar, perhaps? He would grant exemptions to people saying that they didn't have to follow the law. Or if somebody brought a court case, John would say, if you want this court case to be heard in a timely manner, it'll cost you money. And if you want to win, it'll cost you more. Well, Magna Carta had provisions in it to put an end to all of those practices. It stated in clear terms that from now on, the king was not above the law. The king was subject to the law. And this was, as you can imagine, a revolution in constitutional thought.
Well, yeah, and we see that still today in our own founding documents, where we have judicial clauses that require due process, the rule of law, which means that the law applies equally to everybody, which would not have been something terribly popular with a sovereign, such as King John. But it also shows that you'll need warrants and indictments through a grand jury. And so this stuff was reflected back to Magna Carta. Yeah,
that's right. I mean, for example, there's no indictment provision in Magna Carta as there is in the U.S. Constitution, but there's a provision saying that one of the king's agents can't prosecute somebody based upon the agent's own say-so. There have to be witnesses. There has to be some proof other than what the prosecution says in order to prosecute someone. You mentioned due process. Properly interpreted, what the Due Process Clause meant to our founders is that when when the state is proceeding against you, the state has to follow the rules of law as they exist. They can't make up the rules as they go along, which is what King John was doing. And so one chapter of Magna Carta, it's divided into chapters, is chapter 39. It's the most famous chapter of all, and it provides that essentially the crown will not proceed against somebody other than accordance with the judgment of the defendant's peers or the law of the land. And that, many people believe, was put in Magna Carta largely because of this episode I alluded to previously, where John had arbitrarily taken a much admired noblewoman named Matilda de Briouse and locked her up in a dungeon to starve to death.
Well, this actually does sound familiar, and I don't want to make a comparison between the American presidency and medieval English monarchy, but we have seen where, for instance, President Obama granted numerous exemptions to a law passed through the Congress Obamacare, the American
Yeah,
Affordable Care
that's-
Act, which has been exempted. He's offered many, many exemptions. Now that wasn't people paying him for exemptions, but it was an example of people being exempted from the law. So we're still fighting this battle that they fought against King John to try and hold elected officials in government to the rule of law.
It's important to note, Mike, that the granting by the Obama administration of these special exemptions has been criticized by people on the right and the left across the spectrum. And this is a problem which does occur from time to time in our system, where a president is not really following the law, and Magna Carta was directed at that. To give you another example of contemporary application, Magna Carta had provisions in it that granted protections to freemen and even some protections to serfs against having their property taken without their consent and without due compensation. So here we have this clause or clauses in Magna Carta saying the government simply can't requisition your property. Well, it wasn't very long ago, there's this term, that the Supreme Court came out with an opinion, the Horn case, which dealt with a situation where the Department of Agriculture had been commandeering raisins belonging to raisin farmers and keeping as much as 47% of them in a given year. And in an opinion for the court, Chief Justice Roberts said that the provision of the U.S. Constitution does protect personal property just as it protects real property. And when he recites this, he goes back to Magna Carta, explaining about how you can't take somebody's agricultural goods or agricultural provisions without compensation. So here we have a direct line between a Supreme Court case decided, and by the way, on this principle, the court was unanimous. We have a direct line between a 2015 Supreme Court case and provisions in Magna Carta adopted in 1215.
It's fantastic. This thing's still reverberating today throughout our judicial system. So let's talk about a few of the more kind of minor aspects of Magna Carta that still might make a real difference. And one of the things we take for granted here, and that the Supreme Court has found to be a constitutional right, is a simple right to travel. That is, that we can cross boundaries within the 50 states without impediment. And this is actually goes back to Magna Carta also. There was actually a right to travel in there. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that's right. Again, we go back to conduct by King John. We have merchants who want to travel between Europe and England, and John could impede that in various ways and then demand money in exchange for allowing the person to go. So Magna Carta included three interesting provisions. One was that merchants could travel in and out of the kingdom freely. Another one was that everybody else could travel in and out of the kingdom, including foreigners could travel in and out of the kingdom, except in times of war. And if war did arise between a foreigner's country and England, then England would treat the foreigner no worse than the other country treated England. And then there was another provision that people sometimes look at and they say, what the heck is this about? It provided that fish weirs, W-E-I-R, that fish weirs would be removed from the Thames River and the Medway River and every other river in England. Well, why? Well, a fish weir is something, or was used to trap fish, a large trap, but it also had the effect of impeding navigation, impeding travel. And so Magna Carta said, okay, John, all of your fish weirs, in fact, everybody's fish weirs, are coming out of the rivers of England so people can have free right of navigation. When the founders drafted the Commerce Clause of our Constitution, one of the reasons they did was to ensure that Congress could protect the right to travel, and another one was protect the right to navigation.
Interesting. All right. Well, I'm reminding I got to tell you, the stories about King John remind me of the Mel Brooks movie, History of the World Part 1, because there's a great line from there that says, "It's good to be the king." And it sounds like it was pretty good to be King John. And one of the things King John would do would be to arbitrarily levy taxes. So he could just come up to you and say, hey, Rob Natelson, you're a constitutional law professor. If you want to keep teaching constitutional law, you have to pay me 10,000 marks, or whatever the currency at the time was. And he could just arbitrarily do that. So this is actually one of the impetuses of Magna Carta, that they wanted to limit the government's ability to just simply arbitrarily levy taxes. Tell us about that.
Well, yeah. In the feudal system, when on certain particular occasions, vassals had to pay sums of money or services that were called reliefs or aids. And for example, it might happen that someone would die and his heir would have to pay a relief in order to come into the estate. That was accepted. But what John did is he increased the amount of the reliefs. He did so arbitrarily. Well, I realize normally you would only have to pay 50 pounds or 50 marks, but it's going to be 150 for you, And so he would do that sort of thing. So Magna Carta included in one of its chapters, chapter 12, that reliefs and aids, in modern terms taxes, could be levied only by common consent of the realm. And what that meant was that in order for the king to raise taxes, he had to call all the barons together, and they had to agree. Well, this assembly of all the barons was later added to with people who were not barons, knights and burgesses and freemen and so forth, and it became Parliament. And so not surprisingly, when our own founders were fighting against taxation without representation, they pointed out that it is part of the heritage of Englishmen, because at that time they were still English, it's part of the heritage of Englishmen not to be taxed without the approval of their representatives in Parliament. And where did they trace this back to? They traced it back to Magna Carta.
Magna Carta. So King John repudiates this, but then it's brought back. But in the meantime, let's just say that being the king, King God could put his seal on Magna Carta, and then just simply ignore the terms of it because he's the king. What recourse did anybody have against the king? Should he just simply ignore Magna Carta?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, the answer in the original version of Magna Carta was something called the Security Clause. The Security Clause was basically said that there was going to be a committee of 25 barons. And if anybody complained about violations of Magna Carta, they could complain to a subcommittee of 4 barons who would investigate, who would lay forth the grievance before the king, give the king an opportunity to correct it. And if the king didn't correct it, then the 25 barons were permitted to make war against the king. They were absolved of their oath of allegiance, and they could take military action to force the king to honor it. Now, what's interesting about that is it has a faint echo in the U.S. Constitution. Sure. Article 5 of the U.S. Constitution allows the states, who are substitutes for the barons here, allows the states to amend the Constitution, and the procedure is complicated, we won't go into it, but to amend the Constitution in order to rein in the federal government. So in the same way you have the Security Clause in the original Magna Carta to rein in the crown. The Security Clause did not survive in the subsequent issues. However, the English had other ways of bringing the king to heel, and one way was the fact that taxes couldn't be levied, appropriations couldn't be granted without the approval of Parliament. And so when a king got out of line, Parliament would cut off the money. Magna Carta played a very important role in the struggles between the king and Parliament in the 17th century. And then, of course, it resurfaces again in the 18th century with the Americans' grievances against the crown.
Against taxation without representation is a
Taxation
perfect
without
example of this rearing its head again.
That's right.
Years later.
That's right. And another example would be efforts by the British to curtail jury trial in the colonies. Right. They naturally pointed back to Chapter 39 of Magna Carta, no prosecution without a judgment of your peers or accordance with the law of the land. And so they referred to Magna Carta quite a bit, as have freedom fighters throughout history. I mean, most memorable modern example, which the British Library points out, is Nelson Mandela, when he was fighting against the apartheid system in South Africa. Of course, South Africa had a background as a British colony. He pointed to Magna Carta as one of his rallying cries for equality and freedom in South Africa.
So is it much like this allowed what eventually became the House of Commons to start off as the Burgesses and to push back against the king? This comes back to our form of government, where the spending bills start in the House of Representatives, and that the House
yeah.
can defund things.
That's right.
That's their pushback against
Yeah,
excess power in the executive branch.
We didn't adopt the entire British rule. The entire British rule is anything to do with money has to start at the House of Commons, the lower house. The House of Lords can't amend it, just has to say yes or no. Our founders didn't go as far as that, but they did provide that tax bills have to originate in the House of Representatives. The Senate can amend them, but the Senate cannot initiate a tax bill. And that is a distant descendant of terms in Magna Carta.
And Magna Carta also ended up being in the founding documents of some of the American colonies, right?
That's right.
Basically, it was just taken and used for some of the colonies. For instance, Virginia basically had Magna Carta as its foundation.
Yeah, let's go through
Sure.
three quick examples.
Sure.
In 1641, Massachusetts, the colony of Massachusetts, adopted a document called the Massachusetts Body of Liberties. And it set forth certain rights that people have. And the first one was that provision from Magna Carta which said that nobody shall be prosecuted by the state or convicted without a judgment of the peers or according to the law of the land. In the 17th century also, when William Penn set up his new colony of Pennsylvania, he included in his frame of government, his constitution for the colony, provisions from Magna Carta. When George Mason drafted the Virginia Declaration of Rights in 1776, which is the direct ancestor of the U.S. Bill of Rights, he also borrowed provisions from Magna Carta.
All right, look, there's no doubt that lots of monarchs throughout history have signed lots of charters to appease lots of barons to stop them from rabble-rousing. And we don't hear about those charters anymore. I mean, they haven't made their way through history, and they haven't made their way into the former documents. What is it about Magna Carta, this one document that has given it such staying power? I mean, what is it that led it to be used by the founders? I mean, what was the system? How did it stay strong throughout the British common law?
It's a really good question, Mike, and you're absolutely right. There were lots of medieval charters.
Which could be ignored at will by the
right.
monarch once he signed them, right?
Henry I issued a charter making certain promises. Henry II did the same. Charters were issued by French and by Spanish monarchs as well. This one was different. And I think the biggest difference was its universality. I mean, some people will say, well, Magna Carta is just a feudal charter and it's what other people read into it later. That's not entirely true, because what enabled Magna Carta to become a symbol of liberty is the fact that it was far more universal than other charters. In addition to protecting the nobility, for example, it protected the church, it protected women, at least to a certain extent. In fact, not just the provisions I mentioned earlier that specifically were designed to protect women, but also it had provisions throughout it which referred to protections for any person or any free person, which would include women. It included some protections for all free people. It included protections for merchants. And it included some, not a lot, but even some for the half of English population that was unfree, the serfs. They weren't slaves, but they were serfs. And so you have this remarkably universal document for its time, and that, I think, enabled future generations to hold it up as a symbol of freedom.
Now, this would have made its way into the English common law, which would have been in the writings of Blackstone and Blackstone's law. And then our founders, many of whom were lawyers, would have studied Blackstone. So this would be the connection to the American founders, that they were steeped in this legal philosophy already.
Yeah, that's essentially right. It actually goes back a little bit before Blackstone. In the 17th century, Edward Coke, who was a great parliamentary leader and a judge, and is most remembered for writing one of the most influential legal treatises ever. He did an analysis of Magna Carta, a very positive chapter on Magna Carta. And our older founders all read that. When John Dickinson, for example, studied his law in England, he studied Coke. And then the younger founders would have read Blackstone, who also wrote a treatise on Magna Carta. But there's something more, too. Magna Carta was considered not just the law in England, but it was considered part of the supreme law of the British colonies. And so if a law passed by a colonial legislature violated Magna Carta, that law was void, and the courts could ignore it in the same way that a court today can declare a law in violation of the Constitution void. So when the founders declared independence and America started on its own, the idea of there being a supreme law, a constitution, that the lower law had to be in conformance with, that idea was already well established in the British colonies or in British North America. It had been for some time because people recognized that Magna Carta was the supreme law of the land and no mere statute could violate it.
You mentioned the church, and we didn't talk about that, but let's talk about the church for a minute. So the Magna Carta actually has provisions in there to keep the king out of the church's business. Now, this is not disestablishment like we have in our Constitution. Britain did not go that far. In fact, they have an establishment. But tell us about King John's meddling in the church's affairs and how that got into Magna Carta.
Well, King John wanted to dictate who became a bishop, who became an archbishop.
I bet you could get a pretty penny for something like that.
Yeah, and this was not something that the church wanted to see. And so the very first chapter of Magna Carta says that the English church will be free. And when they say free, they mean free of that sort of thing. So there's that in Magna Carta. But in addition, one of the motivating forces behind the document was a man named Stephen Langton. Stephen Langton was probably the greatest biblical scholar and theologian of his age. He was also Archbishop of Canterbury, and he helped negotiate the deal that resulted in Magna Carta, and he helped to ensure that Magna Carta survived after King John died.
Fascinating. Rob, thanks so much. Check us out at independenceinstitute.org. See you next week.